Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking at the effect that Theodore Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency had on American domestic policy. And again, I apologize, this one is a doozy. It's probably going to be way the heck too long. So I'll do my best to just cut to the chase and get through it as succinctly as is possible. So here's your objectives. Take them down, make sure you can answer them at the end, and let's talk about Teddy. So the election of 1900, as we remember, ended Unit 6 with the ascension of William McKinley defeating Bryan's populism, right? And McKinley represented a very conservative brand of the Republican Party, sort of the Republican establishment, against William Jennings Bryan's sort of reformist economic policy. Right. But McKinley, as you hopefully remember, put Theodore Roosevelt, who was the former governor of New York, on the ticket as vice president, mostly to get some populist votes or to get some reformer votes, but also to kind of sideline him. Theodore Roosevelt was basically a thorn in everybody's side, and so the Republican establishment wanted to put Theodore Roosevelt in a position where no one would have to ever talk to him again. And vice president seemed like just that position until Leon Czolgosz assassinated McKinley. And all of a sudden, now you've got Theodore Roosevelt as president of the United States. This outraged the Republican establishment, with Mark Hanna, who, as you hopefully remember, was the kingmaker for McKinley, saying something like, now we've got that damn cowboy in the White House. So let's see what that cowboy is going to do. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive. He was governor of New York at a very young age. He was a rising star within the Republican Party. And he believed in this idea called progressivism, which is the idea that we should be trying to reform society in order to improve it and make it better. And so you find problems and you use scientific sort of solutions to solve them. He combined this belief in reform with a sort of personal charisma. He's a very eloquent speaker, very passionate guy, inspiring story, overcoming asthma as a kid to become really active. And then he took some time off to go be a cowboy out in South Dakota because he thought it would be fun, and then came back and became governor of New York. Oh, he was also at one point police commissioner of New York City, and like really sort of cleaned up New York City as police commissioner. And so he had this long track record of sort of being a reformer and a thorn in the side of the Republican establishment. He also gained fame when he recruited his own cavalry company of, as we mentioned, a combination of Ivy League athletes, cowboys, and Native Americans to go fight in the Spanish-American War. So that also built the Roosevelt mystique. And so he's going to bring that type of reforming zeal to the White House now, and is going to try to metaphorically scrub the problems of the United States off of it, whether the United States wants that to happen or not. So yeah, this is going to be fun. Theodore Roosevelt also became incredibly famous because of one of the things that built Theodore Roosevelt's mystique was an incident when he was campaigning in Mississippi. Theodore Roosevelt went out hunting, and at the end of this hunting trip, they didn't find anything to kill. But as he was sitting down to dinner, one of his aides came up to him and said, Mr. Roosevelt, we found this bear for you to kill." And he goes out, and there's like this baby bear tied to a tree. And Theodore Roosevelt refused to shoot that bear because it was totally unsporting, and he wouldn't just kill this bear tied to a tree. So instead, he had one of his associates club the bear to death and then ate it. But the incident became incredibly famous because toy manufacturers picked up on it, and this began the rise of Teddy's Bears, this stuffed plush toy that goes back to Theodore Roosevelt not shooting a bear tied to a tree. So again, we're building this sort of a cult of personality around himself. Roosevelt gets an almost like Jackson-like mystique, and this is all going to be part of his own personal magnetism and brand. Theodore Roosevelt also was the first president to really understand the power of the press. He once described the presidency as a bully pulpit, and bully at this point meaning great or powerful. And so he understood that now that he's president, the things that he says have a lot of power. And so he started using that to start this thing called the daily press briefing, where he would bring reporters into the White House and then would basically inform them about daily events. He also used his power to give speeches around the country, drawing attention to particular issues, building support for policies, basically all of the things that a president would never have thought of doing up to this point, but that seem 100% commonplace and like an important part of the presidency today. So he's going to make the presidency much more visible and much more important in pushing legislation than it has ever been before. So here's Roosevelt meeting with reporters and basically selling his ideas directly to the American people through this new form of mass media, these newspapers. Teddy Roosevelt also went after the trusts. You hopefully remember the Sherman Antitrust Act, this law that theoretically regulated the trust, but had never really been used. Well, Teddy decided that, hey, now I'm the president of the United States. I don't need a new law to do this. I already have the law on the books, but as president, as chief executive, now I can enforce this regulatory power whenever I want to. And so he used this to convince trusts to behave the way he wanted, in that he wanted to push them back from using these sort of predatory monopolistic policies. And if they didn't, he would break them up. And if they did, he would show restraint to them. And so, by wielding the administrative power of the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt was able to bust trusts that he thought were damaging to the country, while keeping ones going that he thought were beneficial. The first example of this is that Theodore Roosevelt versus the Northern Securities Company. It's a massive trust of two large railroads, and Theodore Roosevelt used the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act to break it up and force and divide it up into a number of smaller companies, thus setting the precedent that the president is now going to be actually enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act sometimes. Another example of Theodore Roosevelt using his administrative power was during a coal strike in Pennsylvania. So there were two different anthracite coal strikes in the early 1900s. These coal miners and coal processors, the workers went on strike because of poor conditions within the mines. And so Theodore Roosevelt stepped in and forced arbitration. On the one hand, he forced the mine owners to give some concessions to the workers, but at the same time, he forced the workers to go back to work because he was worried that increased coal prices would hurt American consumers, especially as winter came on. And so this is a good example of the way Teddy Roosevelt sort of used the power of the presidency to force different groups of people to compromise, despite the fact that up until this point, this was 100% not the job of the president. It should also be noted that it's not as if he was purely on the side of labor, because he did force the union workers to go back to work in order to ensure that we had coal, but he forced some concessions for the bosses. So it's not as if he was purely on the side of the workers or on the side of the bosses. So sitting both sides down and forcing both sides to compromise. The other issue that he tackled, probably least effectively, is the issue of discrimination. Theodore Roosevelt, in general, was against discrimination and against the mistreatment of African Americans. He sat down once for dinner at the White House with Booker T. Washington, which was a huge deal because this was the first time the president had ever dined with an African American man. And they sat down and discussed ways to improve the lives of African Americans. But in reality, Theodore Roosevelt was unable to get anything passed because of the massive racism of the United States during this time period. So, very few gains as far as rights for African Americans, but socially, this was somewhat important. So, 1904 is Teddy Roosevelt's attempt or first opportunity to get a referendum on his progress so far. It's crazy to think that all of this stuff that's happened were in the first 3 years of his term, because, of course, he wasn't actually elected as president, and so he really had no mandate to do the crazy amount of stuff that he was doing within this first term. There was also this sense that he was going to really struggle because the establishment wing of the Republican Party was dead set against him, and the trusts, obviously, not huge fans of him on account of all that trust busting. And so Teddy Roosevelt has to fight against these entrenched interests. But the problem for the Democrats is William Jennings Bryan decides not to run. And so, with William Jennings Bryan sort of stepping back from the picture, he doesn't get the nomination. The Democratic Party is in total disarray. And Teddy Roosevelt's own personal magnetism is going to be on full display here, as he basically takes a leaf out of Bryan's playbook and travels around the company campaigning and trying to and advocating for himself. So he comes up with, in order to try to sell himself, one of the first named platforms in American history, what he calls the Square Deal. And it's got these four components. On the one hand, he's going to provide some protection for workers. On the other hand, he's going to bust trusts that he thinks are bad, but not bust trusts that he thinks are good. He's going to pass protections for consumers, and he's going to pass environmental protection. So he's going to start setting aside more land to be kept in its pristine state to be protected from development. And so in these four sides, all these four goals equally represent Roosevelt's quote square deal. And because of this, he wins in a landslide. It doesn't. I mean, hopefully this looks like a landslide to you because winning 56% of the popular vote is a significant margin, and you've got to remember the southern states are never going to vote for a Republican. Do you remember what that one Republican did in the 1860s? Yeah, where the South is still holding on to that. They're not going to be voting for any of those Union folks. So Teddy Roosevelt wins all the states that aren't voting against Abraham Lincoln, and now with a decisive mandate from a majority of the country, we're off, and the Square Deal is going to be put into practice with a gusto. So, more trust busting. Theodore Roosevelt is going to continue to break up trusts that he feels like act improperly, including breaking up trusts from people like J.P. Morgan, which is going to, of course, outrage Morgan. But Teddy Roosevelt doesn't care about that. He's no longer beholden to the moneyed interests of the Republican Party. And he's going to be protecting consumers and squeezing the trusts to make sure they don't get too wealthy. All of this helps build the mystique of Theodore Roosevelt as standing up to these incredibly powerful interests and sort of portrays him as a defender of the little guy, standing up to, again, the likes of J.P. Morgan and such. Teddy Roosevelt helped shepherd through the Hepburn Bill, which is going to provide teeth to the Interstate Commerce Act, which, as you hopefully remember, was an attempt to regulate railroad rates that utterly failed. Well, now with Teddy's big stick of enforcement, the Hepburn Bill is passed, and railroad rates are going to be standardized and regulated, providing relief for farmers. We also get the release of a book called The Jungle during this time period. The Jungle was a novel by Upton Sinclair that was supposed to reveal the sort of terrible working conditions in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But what it revealed to most people is the fact that, man, they're selling a lot of rotten meat, and people are getting like ground up in the meat, and they're just selling it anyway. And so, with the the realization that you might be eating a non-insignificant part of your meat might be human meat, people decide like we really should try to regulate this stuff. And so we get both the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, creating the precursor to the FDA. So it turns out there's going to be someone looking at exactly how much human meat is in your meat and setting limits on how much you can include in that. There's going to be, you're going to have to put like labels on your food telling people what is in it. And it turns out drugs can't just be a combination of alcohol and heroin. They're going to actually need to be like some type of of actual medicine and to treat whatever the condition is, and not just opiates. So, unfortunately, this means no more cocaine and Coca-Cola, and no more just dosing your children with heroin whenever they start getting grouchy. So, unfortunate. One of the other sort of sides of the Square Deal is conservation. In his first term, Theodore Roosevelt started setting aside land through the New Lands Act to keep some of these outdoor areas pristine. Obviously, during the Gilded Age, we had significantly increased the amount of land under development. So Theodore Roosevelt is representing a change from this to try to conserve national lands. He also sets aside a number of forest areas, including Yosemite and including Yosemite Park in California, which will eventually become the core of sort of the National Park Service. But that whole system is not going to be formalized until Woodrow Wilson, 2 presidents from now. And of course, he's going to start pushing for the protection of different species. And so Theodore Roosevelt becomes a champion of conservation in order to try to save as much of the natural world as he can. So theoretically, he can go kill those animals himself later. So here are the lands that he set aside as national forests, mostly in the west and sort of the south, because of course we've done a very good job of harvesting the forests in the Ohio River Valley. And then eventually these national parks will start to be formally created. The economy crashes in 1907, and so this sort of puts a pin in the end of Theodore Roosevelt's second term, and but fortunately, J.P. Morgan is still wealthy enough to bail out the U.S. economy, and so the depression is short-lived. And then Theodore Roosevelt decides to step down because, he's served his 2 terms. Washington set the informal 2-term limit. And so Theodore and his big stick decide to go take a vacation to Africa, where his goal is to kill every animal on the continent. And so he's going to back his handpicked successor, who's going to carry on his square deal and his policies, a guy named Bill Taft. So in the election of 1908, Theodore Roosevelt is going to anoint Taft his handpicked successor, to say in the proud tradition of, like Martin Van Buren being supported by Andrew Jackson. And the Democrats are going to nominate William Jennings Bryan, who's going to really struggle to overcome the long shadow cast by Theodore Roosevelt. My favorite Taft story is, of course, the story of Billy Possum, where toy manufacturers are concerned that with Teddy Roosevelt leaving office, they're going to lose out on sales of their toys. Instead, tried to look for an animal to represent Bill Taft. And they settled on the opossum because there was a story about Taft who was campaigning in, I think, Alabama. He was served the popular Southern dish possum and taters. And he ate an entire roast opossum on a bed of sweet potatoes, and then later talked about how wonderful it made his stomach feel. And so, with that heroic story, we get the Billy Possum, and the opossum becomes the symbol of Bill Taft. So, that's pretty fantastic. Taft, with Billy Possum on his side, obviously wins in a landslide. Probably more effective than the possum was the support of Theodore Roosevelt. William Jennings Bryan becomes the Henry Clay of his generation, and Taft moves into the White House. Taft is our largest president at over 300 pounds, and he was nowhere near as vigorous as Theodore Roosevelt. In a very real sense, he was more methodical in his application of these principles, but he was also, he did follow through on a lot of these things, even if he really liked to take naps in the afternoon, and his lack of physical vigor really seemed to outrage Roosevelt. So, in a very real way, Taft is going to follow in Roosevelt's footsteps, although he's going to struggle to get tariffs passed, and that's going to be a major sort of area of contention between him and Teddy, because the goal was to reform tariffs and switch to an income tax. The progressives have been pushing for this for a long time, and Taft is going to fail to bring that through, partially because of his lack of personal charisma. Taft is going to continue Theodore's economic policies abroad to some degree. So we're still going to be kind of in the era of American imperialism. But Taft is going to push something called dollar diplomacy instead, which, as opposed to using American military force, now we're going to use American economic force to make it easier for American American companies to invest in areas of Latin America. So we're going to see companies like United Fruit Company, what we call now Chiquita Banana, are going to set up massive plantations within Latin America. And then these corporations are going to bankroll oppressive dictators backed by American money in order to ensure that we get these lucrative deals. These military dictatorships become known as banana republics, and with the basic goal being, again, you're a republic in that the Americans are more or less backing you in exchange for a cheap supplier of fruit. The thing that really dooms Taft, though, is the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, because Taft ends up firing Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, and so this is going to lead to a massive controversy because he was a personal friend of Theodore Roosevelt. And Taft is not going to embrace the type of environmental policies that Teddy had championed. And so Theodore, when he comes back or when he emerges from his African safari, is going to be very irritated with Taft, and it's going to lead to him challenging Taft for the presidential nomination in 1812, which is going to have very, very important consequences for the future of the United States. So we'll tell that story next time. Hopefully, you can answer these questions with some level of detail. And when we come back, we'll lay more of the grounds for progressivism and then move on to the first Democrat elected since Grover Cleveland.